They say the trees are older than time in Stillwater Forest. Out where the land stretches cold and quiet, past the last gas station, past the gravel road with no name, there's a line of dark pine that sways in wind no one else can feel. Hunters won't go there, even in daylight. The old folks speak of it only in whispers, with words like cursed, wrong, or just a shake of the head and a muttered prayer. But the name they fear most is the Wendigo. Not just a creature, they say. A hunger, a shadow, a thing born when the cold gets too deep and the soul gets too thin. It doesn't howl. It doesn't roar. It waits. It watches. And when you hear it, it's already too late. The story I'm about to tell you is passed down to me by my grandfather, who swore it was true. He lived in Stillwater his whole life. Never left, not once. Said there were some places in this world the rest of the world was better off forgetting. This story begins in 1987, in a cabin near the edge of Stillwater. A young man named Elias had moved there that fall, hoping for quiet. He'd inherited the place from an uncle he barely remembered, one of those distant relatives who lived off the land, the kind no one ever saw at reunions. The deed came in a plain envelope, no note, no explanation, just coordinates and a key. Elias had been a city boy most of his life, but something in him wanted change. Maybe it was heartbreak, maybe burnout, maybe just that creeping itch in the bones that whispers, go somewhere else. The cabin was small, dusty, windows fogged with age. The roof creaked in the wind like it was sighing after a long nap. But it was quiet, that kind of deep quiet that almost feels like company, until it doesn't. Elias didn't know it yet, but something was already watching from the woods, waiting. The first few days were peaceful. Elias spent his time clearing brush, chopping firewood, and sweeping out the dust that had collected like old memories. The cabin was old but sturdy. Log walls thick as a man's chest, a stone fireplace, and an oil lamp that gave off a soft amber glow when the nights came early. Stillwater's autumn was something else. The trees burned red and gold in the wind, and the air had that sharp, clean scent of distant snow. Elias liked the way the silence seemed to fold around him at night, like a heavy quilt. He could finally hear his own thoughts, and more importantly, he could rest. He found a journal in a drawer, belonging to his late uncle. Most of it was dull, weather notes, hunting logs, and food stores. But near the back, there were a few pages written in hurried, crooked script. Something's wrong with the woods. Smelled the air. Heard nothing. That's not right. Birds should sing. Dreamed of antlers in the trees. But they weren't from a deer. Elias chuckled the first time he read that. Mountain madness, he thought. Solitude playing tricks on an old man's mind. But then, on the fourth night, he noticed it too. No birds. No insects. No crunch of leaves in the underbrush. The forest wasn't asleep. It was holding its breath. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, he stepped onto the porch and stared into the darkening woods. The trees stood too still, unmoved by the wind. The silence pressed in against his ears like water in a deep lake. And then, far off, maybe a mile, maybe two, he heard it. A long, brittle creak, like tree limbs twisting, followed by a low, guttural whisper. Not quite a growl, not quite a word, just enough to freeze the hair on the back of his neck. Elias stepped back inside, bolted the door, and told himself it was nothing. But as he climbed into bed, the sound echoed in his memory. The way it seemed to say his name, not aloud, but inside his head. Elias. Sleep came slowly that night, and the silence outside deepened into something else, something that listened. Elias awoke before dawn. A pale light spilled through the frosted window, casting long gray fingers across the wooden floor. The fire had burned out during the night, leaving the cabin cold. His breath hung in the air, soft puffs rising as he sat up and pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. He hadn't dreamed, or at least, he didn't remember any dreams. Just a sensation of something nearby, not quite touching him, but close, like someone leaning over his bed while he slept, never blinking. He shook it off and got dressed. Outside, the morning was hushed. A thin crust of frost coated the steps, and the trees stood in silent congregation, tall and unmoving. He walked around to the woodpile, rubbing his hands for warmth. That's when he saw them. Tracks. Long, narrow, pressed deep into the frozen earth. Not quite human. Toes elongated. Barefoot, but not right. They ended just past the tree line, where the brambles thickened and the shadows grew denser. They hadn't been there yesterday. He crouched and ran a finger through one of the prints. It was ice cold, deeper than it should have been, like something heavy had passed through, something that didn't belong in the world of boots and hunting trails. He followed the trail a few paces, curiosity tugging at his ribs. The tracks were spaced wide, as if whatever made them walked with long, loping strides. His breath quickened, fogging the cold air. Then he stopped. 20 feet ahead, nestled between two dead pines, hung a shape. At first glance, it looked like a deer, tall, lean, head lowered. But something was wrong with the limbs. Too long. Back legs bent the wrong way. Antlers that curved like branches, sharp and wrong, as if grown in anger. Elias blinked. It was gone. He stood there, heart pounding, unsure if he'd seen anything at all. No sound, no movement, just the echo of that thing in his mind. He returned to the cabin, slower this time, eyes darting to every tree, every branch that looked too still. He didn't notice the wind had stopped again. That night, the lamps flickered, though he hadn't lit them. And just before sleep claimed him, he thought he heard the creak of footsteps, too slow, too heavy, circling the cabin. He didn't get up. He didn't look. The next morning, Elias drove into the nearby town of Marrow's End, a thin vein of humanity clinging to the edge of Stillwater Forest. It had one gas station, one diner, and a feed store that doubled as a post office. Inside the diner, warmth seeped into his skin as the bell over the door jingled. Coffee simmered behind the counter. The walls were hung with old fishing photos, yellowed maps, and deer antlers that loomed like trophies. A waitress named June gave him a nod. "Ain't seen you before. You settlin' out by the hollow?" Elias hesitated. "I'm staying in a cabin near the forest edge. Inherited it from my uncle Merritt Shaw." June froze, her smile faltering just slightly. "Old Merritt," she said slowly. "Didn't talk much?" "Kept to himself. Smart man, I suppose." She poured his coffee but didn't ask any more questions. A man at the end of the counter, gray beard, hunter's jacket, glanced over. "You hear anything last night?" he asked. "Out in the woods?" Elias paused. "What do you mean?" The man leaned forward, voice low. "Creaking trees that ain't moving. Footsteps you don't see. Lights in the woods. Heard any of that?" June shot him a look. "Don't go spooking him, Carl." But Elias spoke up. "Actually, I did hear something. And there were prints. Strange ones. Barefoot. Out past the cabin." Carl looked grim. "You need to be careful." "Of what?" June sighed. "It's just stories, Han. Old woods. They play tricks on folks. That forest don't sleep right, that's all." But Carl wasn't smiling. He looked Elias dead in the eye. "Your uncle used to say it came when the forest went quiet. When the cold got real deep, and the snow hadn't yet fallen. He said it was hunger made real. Old hunger. The kind that walks on two legs and never stops." Elias frowned. "The Wendigo?" Carl nodded once. "Call it what you want. I just know it watches. Waits. And if it stirred up again, don't stay out after dark." The bell above the door rang as Elias left, the warmth of the diner already slipping from his skin. The wind had picked up. He glanced toward the tree line. It was still. Too still. That night, Elias didn't light a fire. He sat in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the journal he'd found. His uncle's handwriting had become shakier toward the end, almost frantic. One entry in particular kept drawing his eye. "It stands at the edge. Always watching. Always hungry. If you hear the whisper, you must not answer. Not even in your thoughts." Elias shut the book and let the silence settle over him. Outside, the wind curled around the cabin like a cat, brushing the walls and sighing in the gaps. The lamps beyond the windows glowed faintly, a dim halo in the mist. But something about the light felt different, colder. He moved to the window and pulled the curtain aside. Just beyond the trees, the lamplight flickered, briefly revealing a shape. Tall. Still. Wrong. It stood where the forest met the clearing. Not moving. Not breathing. As if someone had planted it there like a scarecrow made of bone and shadow. Elias stared, heartbeat pulsing in his ears. And then it turned. Not fully. Just the tilt of the head. Enough to see the suggestion of antlers against the mist. Enough to feel something like pressure behind the eyes, as if it had noticed him. He stepped back fast and let the curtain fall. He didn't sleep that night. Sometime around 3 a.m., the wind stopped. Dead silence. No trees. No creaking floorboards. Just stillness. Until... Tap. The sound was faint. Deliberate. Tap. Tap. At the window. He didn't move. Didn't breathe. Just sat in the chair with the blanket around his shoulders, staring at the darkened fireplace. Then came the whisper. "Let me in, Elias." Soft. Too soft to be real. But the voice was behind the glass. "I am so cold." It didn't bang. It didn't scratch. It only asked, pleaded. He closed his eyes and covered his ears, trying to calm his breath, remembering Carl's words from earlier. If it stirred up again, don't stay out after dark. He didn't open the door, didn't answer the whisper. Eventually, the light outside faded, but the footprints in the frost were there at dawn. The morning came bitter and slow. Elias barely slept, drifting in and out of shallow dreams where the whisper returned, echoing in a voice that was not his own. His limbs ached from tension. His mouth was dry. Outside, the frost was heavier than before. A ghostly film clung to the windows, and the ground sparkled with hoarfrost. But that wasn't what stopped him cold when he opened the front door. There were footprints on the porch, long bare, pressed deep into the frost. Not shoe prints. Toes. Splayed unnaturally, wide like a stag's hoof yet with distinct, human-like impressions. The trail didn't stop at the steps. It crossed the threshold. He stood there, breath catching in his throat, staring at the prints. They didn't just end at the door. They resumed inside. He backed away, slowly. Every part of his body screamed to run. But where? He grabbed the fireplace poker from the hearth, an old, rusted thing, more ceremonial than useful, and followed the prints. They went in a slow, winding arc through the main room, past the cold fireplace, toward the back wall, toward the bedroom door. He hadn't heard anything. No windows shattered, no locks broken, just silence. The trail stopped at the foot of his bed. Elias stood in the doorway, gripping the iron rod, and stared at the place he had lain hours earlier. The quilt was undisturbed. The pillows still carried the indent from his head. But beside the bed, carved faintly into the wooden floorboards, was a single word: hungry. He left the room in a daze, poured hot water from the kettle into a mug with trembling hands, tried not to look at the window. He didn't know how it got in. He didn't know why it left, but it had stood over him while he slept. That afternoon, Elias nailed the windows shut. Every last one. He stacked firewood against the doors. And still, as dusk crept across the pines, he knew it wouldn't be enough. Because the wind had gone quiet again, and the silence now felt expectant. Elias made up his mind before sunrise. He packed quickly, just the essentials: a thermos, flashlight, his uncle's journal, a hunting knife he barely knew how to use. He loaded the truck in silence, trying not to think about the word carved beside his bed, about how long the thing might have stood there, watching him sleep. The sky was iron gray when he turned the ignition. The old Ford coughed to life and rolled down the narrow gravel path that led away from the cabin. The frost cracked under the tires. The trees flanked the road like sentinels, tall and still. He passed the creek that twisted through the hollow like a silver thread. Then the old hunting shack. Then the bent mile marker that pointed toward Marrow's End. It wasn't until the second time he passed it that he began to panic. Elias slowed the truck, blinking hard. The same bent sign, the same fallen birch beside it. He was sure. He hadn't turned. The road hadn't forked. Yet somehow, he was back where he'd started. He turned around, heart pounding, and drove the opposite direction. Faster this time. Watching the trees blur past the windshield, the mist beginning to gather again at the corners of his vision. 5 minutes. 10. Then, the mile marker. Again. Exactly the same. He hit the brakes. The tires crunched into gravel and sleet. He stepped out of the truck and stood in the road. Breathing. Listening. Nothing. Just the sound of the engine ticking as it cooled. And then, beneath that, something else. Creak. A slow, hollow groan. Which draining. Branches bowing. The same sound he'd heard that first night on the porch. But it was closer now. He turned to the trees and saw movement. A shape between trunks, tall and thin, too pale for bark and too long for a man. Elias ran back to the truck and slammed the door. The shape didn't follow. It didn't have to, because the forest had already closed its jaws. Elias spent the rest of the day in the cabin, pacing, thinking, listening. The forest outside was as still as ever, but now it felt smug, like it had closed the trap and was waiting to see what he'd do next. He unrolled the old wool blanket and dumped the contents of his uncle's journal onto the table: pressed leaves, brittle papers, small sketches of animals, handwritten notes, and a folded piece of yellowing parchment at the very back. It was old. Older than the rest of the book. Hand-drawn, smudged with charcoal and stained by time. It was a map, not of roads, of paths. Narrow, twisting, animal-like trails. Some were marked with excess. Others had symbols: a spiral, a broken arrow, a half-sun. But one in particular caught his eye: a path leading deep into Stillwater Forest. Near the end, circled in thick red ink, were two words written in all capitals. Bone ground. Elias traced the route with a trembling finger. In his uncle's shaky handwriting beside the circle was a note. It watches from the north. You cannot kill it, but you can know it. And maybe that's enough. There were more entries in the margins, frantic and broken. I followed the lights. The lights are not real. It calls with voices I know. Don't eat the meat. He sat back. The map spread before him like an invitation or a warning. The Wendigo, if that's what it truly was, had stalked the family before. His uncle had known it, feared it, and yet he had stayed here, chosen this place as his final home. Why? Elias stared at the map until dusk bled through the windows and the familiar hush descended on the woods again. The forest had gone silent, as if waiting for him to make a move. He folded the map and tucked it into his coat. If the road wouldn't let him leave, he would go deeper. He would find the bone ground, and whatever waited there. Elias left at first light, the sky still bruised with night. He packed light, the journal, a flashlight, a canteen, and a hunting knife he doubted he'd know how to use. The map was folded in his chest pocket, creased at the lines where his uncle had scrawled cryptic notes. He wrapped a scarf around his neck, not just for warmth, but for comfort, something soft between him and the cold. He crossed the clearing and stepped into Stillwater's true forest, where the trees grew older and closer together. Here, the air changed. He could feel it, the hush thickening, the pressure shifting. It wasn't just quiet. It was listening. The path was barely visible, overgrown with frost-tipped moss and tangled branches. But Elias followed it step by step, matching the trail to the sketch on the map. Hours passed. At times he thought he saw motion in the corners of his eyes, small flickers, like shapes darting between trees. But when he turned, nothing. Just trunks and shadows. Then, the voices began. Soft at first, like wind through needles. Elias. He froze. Help me. It was his mother's voice. But she had died when he was 17, and even in life, her voice had never sounded so thin, so hollow. He didn't answer. He just kept walking. The light grew strange as he moved deeper, slanted and green-tinted, like it filtered through water instead of trees. Snow no longer gathered here. Instead, frost clung to the undersides of leaves and roots like mold. The ground was too soft in places, as if it had never truly frozen. And then he came to the circle of stones. There were 12 of them, each as tall as a man, cracked and blackened by age. A ring carved into the earth surrounded them, burned into the moss like a brand. In the center, a single tree stood, dead, charred, split down the middle. It looked like it had been struck by lightning long ago, but still bled sap from the wound, thick and dark like tar. Elias stepped closer. The air grew colder. Something whispered behind him. He turned, but no one was there. Only the feeling of breath on the back of his neck. Elias stood at the edge of the stone circle, the dead tree weeping its dark sap before him, the burned branches frozen mid-reach. Though the air was still, he felt a current against his skin, pulling inward, toward the heart of the ring. It wasn't wind. It was intention. He stepped over the line. The moment his boot touched the earth within, the silence broke, not with sound, but with memory. The forest remembered. He staggered as images flooded his mind. Not his own thoughts, but visions, sharp and cold and old as bone. A fire crackling beneath a blackened sky. Men huddled in furs, starving, eyes sunken with frostbite. The gnaw of teeth on raw meat, desperate. A scream not of pain, but of guilt. Forgive me. A voice from the vision. A man kneeling in snow, tears frozen to his face. Around him, the shapes of others. Hollow. Watching. We had no choice. And then the howl. Not animal. Not human. Something between. A cry of hunger stretched into forever, tearing from the throat of a thing that had forgotten it was once a man. The Wendigo was born in that moment. Forged not by evil, but by desperation. A soul twisted by survival. A hunger that outlived the flesh. Elias dropped to one knee, clutching his head. The visions broke like glass, leaving silence in their place. The forest was still again, but something had changed. The stones around him seemed closer than before, the dead tree taller. And there, at the far edge of the circle, a figure stood. Antlers scraped the low branches. Skin stretched tight over an impossibly long frame. Its arms hung low, fingers brushing the ground. It didn't move, didn't blink, but it was watching him with eyes like burnt ice. Elias didn't scream. He couldn't. The Wendigo stepped back into the trees, vanishing without a sound. He had not been attacked, not chased, not harmed, but he had been seen, and in the marrow of his bones, Elias knew. The hunger had marked him. Elias stumbled from the stone circle, lungs burning in the cold. The trees no longer felt like trees. They pressed in like ribs of something vast and ancient, and every step forward felt like moving deeper into a living thing. He didn't stop to check the map. He couldn't. His hands shook too hard. The vision still clung to him, men around a fire, the bones, the cries. He knew now, the Wendigo wasn't a ghost or a beast. It was a curse, a memory the land refused to forget. It chose the desperate, the broken, the starving, and it waited, always, for someone just desperate enough to become it again. He stopped to rest against a crooked pine, sweat freezing along his brow despite the cold. And then he smelled it. Meat. The scent was subtle at first. Warm, fatty, cooked. Not the rot of something dead in the forest, but the tempting pull of a stew pot on a long winter night. Elias turned. Somewhere in the distance, through the trees, he saw a faint glow, orange firelight flickering low and steady. A camp? Another person? Hope surged in him, reckless and sudden. He pushed toward the light. Branches snapped underfoot. He slipped once, caught himself, heart thudding. As he crested a shallow rise, the glow came into full view. There, in a hollow surrounded by gnarled trees, sat a small fire. A pot swung gently over the flames. Beside it, an old cabin, one he didn't remember seeing on the map. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. "Hello," he called. No answer. He stepped closer, the scent of meat growing stronger. Familiar, comforting. Then he saw them, footprints in the frost. Human, bare, circling the fire. But they weren't fresh. The prints had no start, no end, just a looping pattern, over and over. He approached the cabin and knocked once. The door creaked open. Inside was warm, lit by the glow of the hearth. A table was set for one. A bowl of stew steamed in its place, beside an old wooden spoon. Elias stepped inside, drawn forward, hand hovering near the food. "You're hungry, aren't you?" The voice came from behind him. Elias froze. The voice was soft, almost kind, yet soaked in something deeper, something hollow. He turned slowly, half expecting to see his uncle, or Carl from the diner, or even someone he couldn't quite name. But there was no one there. The doorway behind him stood open. The fire crackled in the hearth. Wind moved faintly through the cracks in the wallboards. "You're hungry." This time, it came from everywhere. Not just behind him, within him. It wasn't a voice in the air, but in his ribs, in his spine, in the part of the mind that dreams while awake. Elias stepped away from the table. The smell of the stew, so warm and rich a moment ago, now turned. There was something underneath it. Something metallic. Wrong. He looked down at the bowl again. It was empty. No, not empty, bones. Small, narrow, clean. The spoon rested on the rim, smeared with something that was not broth. The fire flared suddenly, flames leaping higher, casting long shadows across the floor. The walls seemed to breathe around him, expanding, closing in. Elias backed toward the door, but as he reached for the handle, the doorway had vanished. Where there had once been wood and iron hinges, now there was only bark, trees pressed close, tighter than any wall. He turned back to the room. It was no longer a cabin. It was forest, and the bowl sat at the base of a tree, as if it had always been there. Elias fell to his knees, the world spinning. He closed his eyes and clutched the journal to his chest. A whisper came again, this time in his own voice. "You came to know it." Another voice followed, his uncle's, from a memory he couldn't place. "You don't beat the hunger. You either leave it behind or feed it." Elias opened his eyes. He was back in the cabin, the fire low, the door open again. The stew was gone, and outside, standing just beyond the threshold in the cold light of dawn, was the figure. Antlers high, eyes hollow, waiting. Elias did not run. He stood at the cabin door, breathing in sharp, shallow pulls, staring at the figure in the mist. The Wendigo did not move. It didn't need to. The forest shifted around it, subtly, like ripples on dark water. Its antlers scraped the high branches, motionless. Its limbs bent in ways that suggested bones no longer obeyed the laws of men. The eyes, if they could be called that, burned like coals buried in ash. They did not shine. They did not blink. They waited. Elias stepped backward into the cabin, heart pounding in time with a low, steady throb in his ears. The door creaked as it closed. He dropped the latch. The moment it shut, the world changed. The fire went out. Cold spilled through the cracks. Every wall of the cabin groaned inward as if the forest itself were exhaling. He lit the oil lamp with shaking hands. Its glow cast trembling shadows across the journal on the floor. The map lay open beside it. The bone ground was still circled. But now, a second mark had appeared. A charcoal black X scratched beside the words Red Hollow. He hadn't seen it before. He didn't remember drawing it. Beneath it, in the margins, was a note in his uncle's familiar hand. Where I lost myself, Elias stared. Another place, another trail, another answer or another trap. He didn't sleep. Couldn't. Instead, he packed again. Left the cabin as soon as light filtered through the mist. The Wendigo was gone by then, or at least, not visible. But its absence felt worse than its presence, like a promise half-whispered and left unfinished. He followed the trail east this time. The map's second path was nearly invisible, overgrown, buried in snow-dusted leaves. As he walked, the light dimmed unnaturally, the trees growing so dense they blotted out the sun. And the whisper came again. You don't walk away from hunger. But this time, he didn't flinch. The trail narrowed as Elias moved eastward, barely more than an indentation in the forest floor. Branches reached across the path like fingers, and he ducked beneath them, brushing away clinging frost and spider-thin moss. After nearly an hour, the trees opened. He stepped into a sunken clearing, a natural bowl in the earth surrounded by ridgelines and pale bark trees with bark that peeled like dead skin. The snow here was tinged with a rusty red. It wasn't blood. It wasn't earth. But it felt like both. In the center of the hollow stood a crumbling stone hut, not quite a cabin, not quite a ruin. The roof sagged. The windows were black hollow smoke stains lined the stone above what had once been a chimney. He approached cautiously, the crunch of frost underfoot the only sound. Inside, the structure smelled of ash and damp rot. The hearth was filled with soot and old bones. The walls were marked with symbols, carved deep, over and over, some familiar, some not. The same spiral and broken arrow he had seen on the map. In the far corner, beneath a moldering wool blanket, he found a body, or what was left of one, rib sharp against leathery skin. A jaw stretched open in silent scream. But it wasn't the shape that chilled him, it was the eyes. Even after death, they had not fully clouded. They were glassy, gray, and familiar. Elias knelt. His uncle, or what had become of him? The journal entries suddenly made more sense. The paranoia, the madness, the hunger he'd described but never named. Elias reached for the man's coat pocket and found a scrap of paper, brittle with age. Written in charcoal were the words, "It speaks in our voices. It feeds on memory first, then soul, then flesh. I thought I could outlast it. I was wrong." Elias read the words twice. Then a third time. He wanted to cry, but the tears didn't come. Only a slow, growing pressure in his chest. Then, just outside the hut, the crunch of footsteps. Elias stood. There, in the doorway, stood a figure. Not the Wendigo. His uncle. Alive. Smiling. And whispering, "You shouldn't have come here, Elias." Elias didn't move. The figure in the doorway, the one wearing his uncle's face, smiled faintly. The same crooked grin he remembered from an old family photo, taken long before the man vanished into these woods. The resemblance was perfect, too perfect. "I knew you'd come." The voice was warm. Familiar. Wrong. Elias stepped back, glancing at the corpse behind him, the same face, the same clothes, half swallowed by time and decay. "I buried you a minute ago," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure tilted its head. "No, you remembered me." Elias felt it again, that shifting inside his skull, like something invisible had reached through the back of his mind and pulled a memory forward. His uncle's voice, his laugh, the smell of his pipe tobacco, all summoned too easily. "You're not real," Elias whispered. "I'm real enough to know what you fear." The air in the hut thickened. The wood of the doorframe cracked faintly under unseen pressure. Shadows pooled behind the figure, stretching along the floor like black roots. The smile faded. "You're hungry, Elias. It knows. That's why it chose you." Elias clenched his fists. "I'm not like you. You don't have to be. You just have to stay." The fire in the hearth sparked to life on its own, casting a warm, golden glow across the bones piled inside. For one dizzying moment, Elias wanted nothing more than to sit by that fire, to eat, to forget the cold, the fear. The figure stepped forward, but didn't touch the ground. Its feet hovered just above the floor, as if it were carried by thought alone. Elias backed toward the wall, breathing fast now. He reached into his coat and pulled the map. The firelight illuminated a new mark on the page, a third path, faint and branching off from Red Hollow. No name, no symbols, only a thin charcoal line that trailed into the northeast corner, where nothing else was drawn. The figure stopped. Its mouth opened, too wide, too slow. If you walk that way, it will not bring you back. Elias looked down at the map, then back at the figure. But it was gone. Just a gust of wind through an empty doorway. Just the cold again. The bones by the fire were cold once more. And Elias was alone. Elias left Red Hollow before the sun could fall. The third path, if it could be called that, was little more than a narrow split in the forest underbrush, a line drawn in moss and instinct. The trees here grew closer together, their trunks warped and leaning, as though the forest itself were recoiling from something deeper in. The map gave no label, no warnings. Just the line. And yet he followed it. Each step forward felt like stepping backward in time. The air turned dense, like fog you couldn't see but could taste, thick with rot, old wood, and something almost sweet, like meat gone soft in the heat. Though the sky still glowed faintly behind the treetops, little light reached him. Here, the forest was not dead. It was waiting. The whisper followed him now, ever present, like a second heartbeat. You know this place, Elias. At times, he felt like he did. A bend in the path looked familiar. A fallen log shaped like a half-sunken spine. The curve of a stone wall, overgrown but unmistakably man-made. Had he been here before? In dreams? In stories? He didn't remember. But something in him did. The further he went, the more the woods seemed to change, not decay, not crumble, but unravel. Tree limbs bent into unnatural arches, curling down toward him. The air shimmered without heat. Sound stretched. His own footsteps echoing too long, twigs snapping like distant gunfire. Then he saw it. A circle of stumps, massive and low, ringed with white stones. Each stump was carved with symbols, spirals, jagged lines, runes that looked more like claw marks than script. And in the center, bones. Dozens of them. Clean, arranged in precise spirals. Human and animal, indistinguishable now from one another. At the very center, a single skull sat atop a flat stone, split down the middle, hollowed by time. Elias approached, knees weak. The whisper returned, closer now. This is where it began. A shadow passed through the clearing, tall and narrow. Elias turned sharply. No one. But something had shifted again, something deep in the bones. One of the skulls was smiling. Elias stared at the spiral of bones, breath fogging in front of his lips. The clearing had no wind, yet the trees swayed, subtly, rhythmically, like they were breathing with him. Or for him. The skull at the center still seemed to grin, though he knew that was impossible. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something in the clearing was watching. Not from the trees, not from above, but beneath. He circled slowly, avoiding the stones. Every step felt like stepping through someone else's dream, familiar, but wrong. The runes on the stumps pulsed faintly in the dying light, and as he looked closer, Elias realized they weren't just carved. They were branded, as if burned into the wood. The whisper returned, low and full of weight. He took, and would not stop. A gust of wind swept through the clearing, icy, sudden. The bones rattled like dry leaves. Elias dropped to a crouch, arms bracing against the cold. The voice in his head deepened. He ate when others starved. He became the first Wendigo. Elias's hand trembled as he reached toward the skull. Not to touch it, just to confirm it was real. As his fingers hovered near, the ground beneath him shifted. Not a quake, a memory. He was no longer in the clearing. He stood in a vast, snow-covered plain. The sky above was black with storm. A man staggered across the field, wrapped in tattered furs, carrying something bundled in cloth. A child, dead. The man collapsed beside a tree, sobbing. I didn't mean to. His voice cracked. Wind held around him. The snow swallowed everything. Then, silence. The body at the man's feet vanished, replaced by firelight. A bone. A bite. The man cried once more, then stopped. When he rose, his eyes were no longer human. The vision shattered like ice. Elias stumbled backward into the present, heart thundering. The clearing was still, the bones unmoved, but something had changed inside him. He could feel it, just beneath his ribs. A slow, coiling ache. Not pain. Hunger. And he wasn't sure it was his. Elias stumbled out of the clearing. Branches scraped his coat, twigs cracked underfoot, but he didn't stop. The whisper followed him, not just in the air, but inside his body, a gnawing presence threaded through his spine like cold wire. He wanted to scream, but the sound died in his throat. The forest changed around him. It had always been strange, but now it felt responsive, as if each step shaped the world a little more wrong. Trees leaned at sharper angles. The snow melted where he passed, replaced by thick, dark moss. The air grew humid, and a dull warmth crept into his coat, clinging like sweat. "You're remembering now," the whisper said. "That's how it begins." He didn't know what that meant. The map in his pocket was damp, useless. The ink had bled. The paper curled like dead leaves. He found a trail, wide, trodden, familiar. Relief surged through him. He had been here before. This was the ridge above Stillwater. He could follow this back. He could find the cabin, the road, the truck. He ran. Snow cracked underfoot, and roots grabbed at his boots, but he didn't care. The wind rose behind him like a voice made of breath and wood. As he came around the bend, he saw the clearing. The same clearing. The spiral of bones. The grinning skull. He had run in a circle. "No," Elias whispered. "No, I was going north." There is no north anymore," the forest whispered. "Only in." He turned and ran again. Downhill. South. No path. Just instinct. The trees blurred. His legs burned. His breath tore through his throat. And then, a door. Standing in the woods, alone. No walls. No hinges. Just a tall wooden door, frame and all, weathered and frostbitten, upright in the dirt. It should have been absurd, but it radiated warmth. He stepped closer, reaching for the handle. Behind him, twigs snapped, too high off the ground. He didn't look. He opened the door and stepped through, and the world blinked. The trees vanished. He stood in his childhood bedroom. The bed, the shelves, the old posters peeling off the wall, and on the desk, a bowl of soup. Hot, steaming. The smell made his mouth water. "Eat," said a voice from the hallway. "You need your strength." Elias backed toward the window. Outside, the trees waited, but they had his eyes. Elias stood frozen in his childhood bedroom. Everything was exactly as he remembered, down to the faded blue quilt, the cracked lamp on the nightstand, and the creak of the floorboard near the closet. The room smelled of warm cedar and old books, comforting, nostalgic. But the bowl of soup on the desk sent a chill through him. Steam curled gently upward from its surface. It looked perfect, familiar. He hadn't had that soup in over 20 years. Chicken with wild rice, the kind his mother used to make when snow buried the sidewalks and school was canceled. But she was gone now. She had been for years. "Eat," the voice repeated, softer now, coaxing. "You're not like them, Elias. You came back. You remembered." He turned toward the hallway. No one stood there. Just an open door, leading into a house that shouldn't exist. His house. The one long demolished, hundreds of miles away. Elias backed toward the window, trying to control his breath. His fingers touched the glass. Cold. Real. But when he looked through it, the forest was waiting, his face in every tree, eyes hollow and gleaming. He gripped the window latch, but his reflection in the pane stopped him cold. It wasn't right. His eyes, black around the edges, pupils too wide, and just for a heartbeat, his teeth looked too long. He stumbled back, knocking over the bowl. It shattered on the floor, though the soup didn't spill. It simply evaporated. The room grew colder. The wallpaper peeled away in long strips, revealing bark beneath. The lamp buzzed and dimmed. The bed sagged and withered like a rotting carcass. "You're almost ready," whispered the trees outside. "You've remembered the hunger. All that's left is the choice." The door behind him, the one he'd stepped through, was gone. Only the closet remained, slightly ajar. A slow breath escaped from within. Elias stared. He took one step, then another. He reached out and opened it. Inside, there was nothing but snow and antlers. The snow beyond the closet door shimmered, untouched, like a frozen lake blanketed in moonlight. Elias stepped through into silence. It wasn't cold, not like before. The chill here was different. Still, heavy, like the air in an old tomb. The world had no sky, only trees that circled like sentinels, tall and unmoving. Their trunks formed a ring, perfect in its symmetry. Their limbs curled overhead like the fingers of a sleeping giant. And in the center of it all stood the Wendigo. Closer now, clearer. Its body was stretched, all bone and hide, as if it had been a man once but had forgotten how to wear the shape. Its skin clung in gray ribbons to its frame. Its eyes, coal-black and endless, watched without blinking. And Elias felt none of the terror he expected. Instead, he felt recognition. The creature tilted its head, slowly, not as a threat, but like a question. "You've seen," it said, not aloud, but inside him. A voice made of memory. "You've eaten the dream. You've tasted the edge." Elias's chest ached, not from fear, from hunger. Something inside him stirred. A memory, not his own, of walking for days on frost-bitten feet, of snow that never ended, of chewing bark until gums bled, of taking the only meat left. "I didn't want this," he whispered. The Wendigo stepped forward. Antlers scraped the trees. "No one does." It raised a hand, long and branch-thin, palm facing up. And in it, his uncle's locket. How it had survived, he didn't know. He hadn't seen it in years. He took it with trembling fingers, snapped it open. Inside, 2 photographs. One of his uncle, the other him, younger, frilier, sad-eyed. A boy who once stood by the fire, afraid to sleep alone. Elias looked up. The Wendigo stepped closer. Its form shifted. His own face stared back now, aged, worn, wild. The whisper was softer now. "You are the hunger, the memory, the echo. All you must do is stop running." The clearing dimmed. Elias stood between what he was and what he might become. Elias held the locket tight in one fist, the sharp edge of the clasp pressing into his palm. The picture of his younger self stared up from it, eyes wide, uncertain. The boy who had once feared the dark now stood in its heart. The Wendigo mirrored him. Same eyes, same face, but stretched by years that never passed, worn by hunger that never faded. Its voice came again, gentler now. "You carry me. Always have. The question is, will you carry me willingly?" Elias stepped backward, boots crunching softly in the snow. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream, to deny it all, to wake up and find himself in the cabin by the fire. But the cabin was gone. The forest had taken it. Or maybe it had always been part of this place. He looked down at his arms. Veins darkened beneath the skin. His fingers, thinner than before. Bones more visible. Had he eaten? He couldn't remember. Had it been days? Hours? His breath misted in the air, but so did the Wendigo's. It wasn't dead. It wasn't spirit. It was continuing. He spoke, voice cracking. "What if I say no?" The figure didn't move, but the forest answered. The trees moaned, a long groan of bending trunks. The ring of snow darkened. The locket grew colder in his hand. "Then you will forget," it whispered, "and hunger will find another." Elias looked around. The clearing, the ring of trees, the bones just beneath the snow's surface, glinting faintly. He thought of his uncle, of the man who came to these woods for quiet and found only echoes, who thought he could resist and ended up feeding the roots beneath the snow. He looked again into the Wendigo's eyes. They were his, and he understood. It wasn't a curse, not entirely. It was a choice, made slowly, step by step, thought by thought. You didn't become the Wendigo all at once. You became it by giving in. Elias took a step forward. The wind hushed. Another step. The Wendigo raised its head, its gaze fixed. And Elias, locket still clenched in one fist, whispered, "Then I choose." The clearing grew utterly silent as Elias spoke. "Then I choose." The Wendigo froze, head tilted, antlers gleaming with hoarfrost, the mirrored image of Elias flickering like candlelight in a draft. "You would accept it?" the whisper asked. Not with triumph, not with menace, but with uncertainty. Elias didn't answer immediately. He let the stillness settle, let his heartbeat echo through his ears like distant thunder. He looked down at the snow, saw the swirl of footprints circling themselves, the bones buried shallow beneath. He remembered the visions, the starving man, the child's limp body, the trembling hands reaching toward forbidden warmth. The first choice. The oldest. "No," Elias said at last. "I won't give in." The Wendigo's head slowly lowered. The whisper deepened. "Then why are you here?" Elias took one final step forward and opened the locket. Inside, his face stared back. Tired, fragile, human. "I came to remember," he said, "so I wouldn't forget who I was, or what this thing really is." He knelt in the snow, placed the locket on the ground between them, and let his hand fall away. The Wendigo didn't move. "I see you now," Elias said softly. "Not as a monster, not a myth, but as a warning. The forest shivered. For a moment, nothing moved, and then the wind returned. It surged through the clearing, lifting flakes of snow into a vortex that spun between them. The locket vanished beneath the flurry. The bones sank, drawn down as if pulled by unseen roots. The Wendigo began to fade. Its shape flickered, Elias's face again, then the starving man's, then something in between. It opened its mouth but made no sound. The antlers cracked like drywood. The shadow collapsed inward, and then it was gone. The clearing brightened, not by sunlight, but by a pale, silver glow that had no source. Elias stood alone, cold, whole. The hunger remained, faint as a scar, but it no longer called his name. The clearing was empty now. No bones, no markings, no Wendigo. Only Elias, the whisper of wind through old pine, and the locket, buried somewhere beneath the snow. He left it there. Some things were meant to be laid down, not carried. He turned toward the trees. They parted easily this time. No groaning limbs, no leaning trunks. Just a narrow path bathed in soft silver light, like moonbeams stretched into a road. He walked in silence. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from fear or fatigue, but from the weight of what he now understood. The hunger wasn't something that lived only in the dark. It lived in people, in grief, in silence, in desperation. It lived in choice. He passed through familiar places now, bent trees, frost-kissed undergrowth, stones he remembered stepping around on the way in. But they had changed. Or maybe he had. The path widened. The trees thinned. And then he saw it. His cabin. Still standing. Still quiet. Smoke curling faintly from the chimney. Elias approached slowly. The windows were lit. Golden glow spilling onto the snow. The scent of pine wood in the air. It felt real. Inside, nothing had moved. The blanket still lay where he dropped it. The journal sat open, the map beside it. The circle of bone, gone. He crossed the threshold and sat by the cold hearth. The silence returned, but this time it was gentle. No longer pressing, no longer hungry. Just still. He closed his eyes, let the silence hold him, and slept for the first time in what felt like days. And somewhere, deep in the hollow, trees swayed again. Birds sang, faint and far away. The forest breathed, but it did not whisper. Not that night. Elias woke to the sound of soft birdsong. The morning light filtered through the fog, dappling the wooden floor of the cabin in shifting patches. Outside, the frost was melting. The hush of the forest had changed, still quiet, but not tense, not expectant. He stretched slowly, muscles aching from sleep he hadn't allowed himself in too long. For a moment, he wondered if it had all been a dream. If the spiral of bones, the voices, the Wendigo, if any of it had truly happened. Then he looked down. A single, blackened antler lay on the floor beside the hearth. Not large, not sharp, but unmistakable. He didn't touch it, just stared. A souvenir, a reminder, a marker that the hunger was not destroyed, only understood. Later that morning, he walked down to the road. It was clear. The loops that had once turned him around were gone. The mile marker pointed west like it always should have. The signs were legible. The birds followed him. He drove into town. The diner still stood. Carl sat at the counter, same coat, same coffee. June gave him a cautious look when he walked in. "Thought you left," she said. Elias gave her a tired smile. "Thought I would too." He sat, ordered eggs, ate in silence. When he finished, Carl leaned closer. "You saw it, didn't you?" Elias met his gaze. "I saw something." Carl nodded slowly. "You don't forget it, but you learn to live beside it." Elias reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a page from the journal, the one that showed the map, now just a faded outline of paths he would never walk again. He slid it across the counter. "Maybe someone else won't have to get that far," he said. Carl looked at the page, folded it carefully, and tucked it away. "You staying?" Elias looked toward the trees outside the diner. The way they waved, gently now, like old friends no longer keeping secrets. "I think I'll fix up the place," he said. "Keep the lights warm." That night, back at the cabin, he lit the fireplace. He placed the antler above the mantel. And as the wind moved through the woods, soft and unhurried, Elias listened, not for voices, not for hunger, but for peace. And this time, there was no whisper, only silence, real, earned, and whole. Years passed. The forest stayed. Stillwater Hollow grew quiet again, not with fear, but with rest. The trees no longer leaned as sharply. The frost came and went with the seasons. The silence returned, but it no longer pressed like a weight on the chest. It was the kind of silence that let you breathe. People still told stories, of course. They always would. At the diner, new names replaced old ones. The coffee stayed the same. Carl's beard grew wider, and June eventually passed the counter to her niece. But the map Elias left behind stayed in a drawer by the register. Now and then, a traveler would ask about it, and June's niece would shrug and say, "That's for if the woods start whispering again." Elias never left the cabin. Not really. He grew older, slower, but he kept the path clear. He repaired the roof. He planted a new pine where the old one had fallen. And every autumn, he lit lanterns along the trail, not to guide anything away, but to help people find their way through. Some nights, when the fog rolled in thick, locals swore they saw him walking the tree line, coat drawn tight, lantern in hand. Just a silhouette, never too close, always watching. No one feared him, because the Wendigo never came back. Or maybe it never had to. Sometimes, Elias would wake before dawn, the sky just starting to soften, and sit on the porch with a cup of strong, bitter tea. He would listen to the stillness and feel the forest settle around him like a blanket. He didn't need to speak. He had remembered. He had chosen. And the hunger that had once echoed through the pines? It had grown quiet. Not because it was gone, but because someone had finally listened. And so the woods remained, with trees that remembered, with paths that twisted, with silence that could be trusted, and a man who had walked into the heart of the legend and came back whole.